Welcome back to Governance Matters. You know us. We dive deep into boardroom best practices and strategic leadership insights. This is the place where we help board members, executives, and governance professionals, elevate decision-making and all of that organizational impact. We're taking on corporate governance again, really getting into the weeds of information flow between management and boards.
Oh, yeah, a crucial aspect. And honestly, one that often gets overlooked.
I know, right? You've got these boards responsible for massive decisions that impact, well, the entire organization. But how can they possibly do that effectively if they're not getting the full picture?
Exactly. That's the crux of it, the information gap. This whole episode is about exploring how boards can get the information they need to really, truly govern well.
Okay, so let's break this down. We've got a whole pile of sources here. Reports, case studies, even some parallels from history. What's the mission for this deep dive?
The goal is pretty straightforward. Help you understand the dynamics of this information flow, why it matters so much, and what strategies boards can actually use to make sure they're getting unbiased, complete data.
Got it. So it's not just about having information, it's about having the right information, presented in a way that allows for independent judgment.
You got it. It's about empowering boards to ask the hard questions, challenge those assumptions that might be floating around, and ultimately make decisions that benefit the organization and its stakeholders.
And that's got to be important for anyone involved in governance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whether you're on a board yourself, advising one, or just interested in how organizations work.
Exactly, because, let's face it, information is power. And when that power gets concentrated in the hands of management, it can create a real imbalance,
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see why this is such a big deal.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into the modern boardroom, I hear we've got a pretty interesting historical example to set the stage. Something about Napoleon.
Ah, yeah, Napoleon. It's a fascinating contrast, really. The emperor, known for his dominance, yet the French civil code he championed was incredibly just and procedurally sound.
Wait, hold on. How can a system with a leader like Napoleon at the top be considered fair? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, that's where Jean-Étienne Marie Portalis comes in. He was essential in drafting the code, and he understood that even with a strong leader, like Napoleon at the helm, success in the long run depended on fair processes and information flow.
So even Napoleon, with all that power, recognized the need for checks and balances.
Exactly. Portalis made sure the code wasn't just about Napoleon's will, but about establishing a system that was just and transparent. Information had to flow freely, decisions were made through a clear process. It was a big deal.
Wow, it's a pretty powerful lesson. It's not enough to just have a strong leader. You need the right systems in place to make sure things stay fair and balanced.
Absolutely. And that applies to organizations today just as much as it did back then. Think about leaders you've encountered. Do they prioritize just processes, or do they try to control information to hold on to power?
That's a really good question. Something to think about as we dive into the specifics of modern governance challenges. We've got a lot to unpack, so let's move on to those practical strategies for dealing with this information gap. What can boards actually do to get the full picture?
Well, one thing that comes up a lot in the research is the use of 360-degree assessments. These tools can give a much broader perspective on management performance than just relying on the CEO's reports.
So instead of just getting the CEO's take, the board gets feedback from multiple sources. People who actually work directly with management.
Exactly. It helps create a more holistic picture, and it can potentially uncover blind spots that might not be obvious from the top down.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like getting multiple data points to figure out the truth.
Yeah.
Instead of just relying on one potentially biased source.
Right. And another key strategy is direct engagement with employees and stakeholders.
Now, that one's interesting. What does that look like in practice? Are we talking about board members shadowing employees?
Not necessarily, but it could be things like attending town hall meetings, meeting with department heads outside of those formal presentations, or even having designated board liaisons for different parts of the organization.
So it's about getting out of the boardroom and actually seeing how things work on the ground.
Precisely. It lets board members hear different perspectives firsthand, understand potential concerns, get a real sense of the overall culture.
That sounds incredibly valuable, but also potentially time-consuming. How do boards balance that kind of engagement with all their other responsibilities?
It definitely requires a commitment to being proactive, but the payoff can be huge in terms of understanding the organization deeply. And it doesn't have to be every single board member doing everything. Delegation and clear roles within the board can help.
Okay, so we've got 360-degree assessments, direct engagement with stakeholders. What other tools are out there?
Well, a surprising number of sources emphasized how important it is for boards to invest in their own education. Directors should be actively looking for opportunities to learn more about ethical issues, fiduciary duty, and industry-specific challenges.
So it's not enough to just have experience in business in general. You need specific knowledge about governance.
Exactly. And this knowledge has to keep evolving. To be truly effective, board members need to be constantly learning, staying ahead of the curve.
That makes sense. The business world is always changing, so governance has to adapt too.
Absolutely. And, one source made a really interesting connection between board governance and leadership coaching.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, just like good leadership coaching takes a holistic approach, looking at the individual within their system, effective board governance means going beyond just relying on one source of information.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture, understanding how things connect, and getting information from multiple perspectives.
You got it. It's about creating a culture of continuous learning and improvement, even at the board level.
That's a fantastic point. And a great segue into our next section, where we'll dive into the fascinating world of decision-making psychology. Because even with all the right information, we've still got those cognitive biases that can trip us up.
Oh yeah, the human element. That's where things get really interesting.
Can't wait. Lead the way.
So let's talk about anchoring bias. It's super common. You're on a board, right? You're considering an acquisition, and the first valuation you see is, say, $100 million.
Okay, 100 million. Big number.
Yeah. And even if it's just a preliminary estimate, it can really anchor your thinking. Even if later on due diligence suggests a totally different price is better, that initial number can stick with you.
You're saying that first impression, that first number, can really mess with our perception of what's reasonable, even if logically we know better.
Exactly. It's a powerful subconscious thing. Boards really need to be aware of it, especially when you're talking about complex financial decisions.
So how do you fight that? It sounds almost hardwired.
Well, awareness is the first step. Just
Yeah.
knowing this bias exists can help you be more critical of those initial valuations. And look for different perspectives, Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
So don't just accept that first number at face value. Dig deeper, ask questions, challenge those assumptions.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to bring in outside experts who can give you an unbiased view.
That's a good point.
Right.
Sometimes you need that fresh perspective to break free from those anchors.
Now, another trap that boards can fall into is the framing effect.
Okay, framing effect. This sounds interesting. How does that play into boardroom decisions?
Well, think about it. The way a problem or even an opportunity is presented can have a huge impact on how we see it. And that, of course, influences the choices we make.
So it's not just the facts, it's how those facts are presented, the packaging.
Exactly. Let's say there's a risky venture. If it's framed as a chance for growth, the board might be more likely to take the gamble.
But if it's presented as a potential loss, they'd be more cautious, even if it's the same venture at its core.
Precisely. And this is where that information gap we talked about earlier comes back into play. When boards don't have independent data, they're more vulnerable to these framing effects.
Because they're relying on management to present the information, and management might have their own agenda, right?
Exactly. And that can lead to decisions that aren't actually in the best interests of the organization.
So it's super important for boards to have access to different viewpoints and to be able to frame those problems themselves independently.
Absolutely. And that's where a culture of open communication and healthy disagreement is so important.
I see boards need to feel comfortable challenging assumptions, questioning how issues are framed, and considering alternative viewpoints.
Exactly. Which brings us to the idea of building a high-performance board. It's not just about dodging those pitfalls. It's about actively creating an environment that encourages good decision-making.
Okay, I'm all ears. What makes a board high-performing? What are the key ingredients?
Well, first and foremost, they embrace what's called fair process. It's about having clear procedures, engaging with the relevant stakeholders, and making sure decisions are transparent.
So it's about creating a system that feels fair and unbiased, even if the outcome isn't what everyone wants.
Precisely. It's about building trust and making sure everyone feels heard and respected.
Makes sense.
What else? Closely tied to that is fostering a culture of open communication.
That seems to be a theme here.
It is, and for good reason. It allows for challenging assumptions, presenting different perspectives, making sure everyone's voice is heard.
So it's about creating an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up, even if their views go against the grain.
Exactly. And it's about valuing those dissenting opinions as sources of insight, maybe even innovation.
Which can be tough, right?
Yeah.
Especially in a hierarchical setting like a boardroom.
It takes effort, definitely. But the payoff, in terms of better decisions and a more engaged board, it's worth it.
And finally, our sources emphasize the importance of succession planning.
Yes, a well-executed CEO succession process, like the one MasterCard did, shows how valuable long-term thinking, internal talent development, and board involvement can be.
So it's not just about finding a replacement when the CEO retires. It's about creating a whole pipeline of future leaders and making sure that transition of power is smooth.
Exactly. And it's about the board taking an active role in shaping the future leadership of the organization.
And we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into this information gap between management and boards.
Absolutely. It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've talked about why this gap exists, what makes it so challenging, and some really powerful strategies to bridge it.
Right. And now it's time to see how these principles actually work in real-life situations. We've got some great examples of companies doing this really well, each with their own unique approach.
Let's dive in. Where do we start?
Let's start with MasterCard. Remember how we talked about succession planning being crucial for good governance? Well, their CEO succession process is a perfect example of how to do it right.
Okay, yeah, what was it about their approach that made it so effective?
They didn't just wait until the CEO announced retirement. They started planning years in advance, involved the whole board, and looked at a wide range of candidates, both from inside and outside the company.
So it was a truly collaborative process, not just a decision made at the top and passed down.
Exactly. And they went beyond just finding a replacement. They really invested in developing a pipeline of future leaders, created a program to spot high-potential employees, gave them leadership training, and even exposed them to the board.
That's really smart. It's like building a bench of talent ready to step up when the time comes.
Precisely. And the result was a seamless transition to a new CEO who was totally prepared and had the full support of the board.
That's a fantastic example of how proactive planning and a commitment to developing your own people can pay off in the long run.
Oh.
Okay, what's our next case study?
Let's switch gears a bit and look at Danone, the global food company. They've had their share of challenges lately, including pressure from activist investors.
Yeah, I remember that. It was all over the news.
Right. But what's interesting is how their strong board culture helped them navigate that turbulence. They have this long-standing tradition of open dialogue, being able to disagree constructively, and a real willingness to listen to different viewpoints.
So even when things got tough, they stuck to their principles of good governance.
Exactly. And that allowed them to make decisions that were truly in the best interests of the company and its stakeholders, even if those decisions weren't popular with everyone.
That really shows how important it is to build a resilient board culture, one that can handle pressure and stay focused on the long-term health of the organization.
Absolutely. And for our final example, let's look at SEEK, a Russian coal mining company.
Okay, SEEK. What makes them stand out?
They've been real leaders in using technology to make their board more effective. They implemented a secure board portal so directors can access data in real time, review documents, and collaborate online all in one place.
So they've really embraced that whole digital transformation of board governance.
Exactly. No more lugging around those massive board books or dealing with last-minute email attachments. They're also using video conferencing and virtual meeting rooms to connect more easily and more often.
That makes a lot of sense, especially for a global company like SEEK. It gives them that agility and responsiveness.
Precisely. And it shows how technology can be this powerful tool to bridge the information gap and really empower boards to be more efficient and effective.
These real-world examples are so insightful. It seems like there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there's a common thread of commitment to those core principles of good governance.
You got it. Transparency, open communication, being willing to adapt and evolve. Those are the things that make boards successful no matter what industry they're in or how big they are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah.
What should they be thinking about as they go back to their own organizations and face those governance challenges?
Well, the first thing to remember is that bridging this information gap, it's not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process.
It's about constantly looking for ways to improve how information flows, how communication happens, and how effective the board can be.
Exactly. And it's a shared responsibility. It's not just on the board or management or even technology. It takes a collaborative effort from everyone involved.
So it's about fostering a culture of good governance at all levels of the organization. Everyone understands their role. Everyone's committed to working together.
Exactly right. And don't forget about that human element we discussed. This information gap isn't just a technical problem. It's also about addressing the psychological factors that can get in the way of good decision-making.
like those biases we talked about. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to speak their minds, where they trust each other, and where they can disagree constructively.
Absolutely. Where different perspectives are welcomed and challenging assumptions is encouraged. Because when it comes down to it, the quality of a board's decisions depends on the quality of the information they have and how well they can discuss that information.
So well said. And on that note, I think we've successfully navigated this deep dive into the information gap between management and boards. Thanks for being our guide on this journey.
It's been a pleasure. And always remember, good governance is everyone's responsibility. So go out there, be a champion for transparency, accountability, and making sure decisions are based on solid information.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for better governance.